Research that resonates.
Schweizer has not been wrong on any of his years and years of reporting on the Bidens.
Investigations that matter.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of Burisma?
I don't know. Probably not. But that's, I don't think that there's a lot of things that would have happened in my life that if my last name wasn't Biden.
The only entities, the only people that would report on this, and Peter Schweizer, who deserves a Medal of Freedom, in my view.
This is The Drill Down with Peter Schweizer.
Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to this special edition of The Drill Down, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. This is a special edition, Eric Eggers co-host, because we have an election tomorrow, and we are tracking certain things that people may not ordinarily be tracking. I like to think that people are looking at what's going on the surface. We're looking underneath, deep in the river trends, and there's some things that we're watching that we're concerned about from the standpoint of election integrity.
You might say we do some drill downs into the areas below the surface that people should be looking at. We're not just looking at the polls. I know a lot of people are wondering who's going to win this week. Some people are wondering when will we know who has won this week.
Yeah.
And just like a few different factors to be aware of that we're paying attention to, that we're not trying to like dampen anybody's enthusiasm. We're just saying, hey, actually, the more I've looked into this, the more optimistic I am that these issues continue to be raised and flagged ahead of time, which I think was not the case 4 years ago.
Everybody was caught flat-footed, or at least a lot of people were. We weren't, because you'd written a book in 2018 on the issue of voter fraud, but everybody was kind of shocked that the system wasn't working in the eyes of some, and you had this sort of virulent reaction. Now people are actually watching it and paying attention to it. And let me tell you one that I'm watching.
Okay.
There's a organization called America's Digital Shield. You can go to their website, americasdigitalshield.com, and it's run by Dr. Robert Epstein, who's a friend of ours. We worked with him on a documentary film that you produced called
The Creepy Line.
Creepy Line.
And not because it starred you.
Although some might say that was a good title for it. But in all seriousness, what he does is he tracks the online experiences that people are having.
Yeah.
He's got 13,000 people across the United States in all 50 states, and he's tracking what are the big tech companies, Google, Facebook, Meta, Twitter, or X, what kind of experiences, and is there perceived bias occurring among those outlets?
Speaking to things that have changed. So we did this film, The Creepy Line. It came out in 2018. It was based in part on his research. In 2016, he tracked something called search engine manipulation effect and the autofill. So basically, he tracked how Google and Facebook could, without the consumer knowing it, shift behavior that would impact the election. And he had estimates that the people that were the most susceptible to being shifted were independent and moderate voters, and their votes could be shifted up to 30%. And he showed us, and we have evidence in the film of things that they did to help try to steer the election towards Hillary Clinton. Remember, at the time, Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, I think, was basically like an unpaid volunteer for the Clinton campaign. He obviously helped run the Obama campaign. So this was not a secret that big tech was in the bag against Donald Trump. They continue to be so today, only now Dr. Epstein and his team are doing a good job of actively tracking in real time what that looks like.
That's right. Through this America's Digital Shield, you can go to the website, of course, and you can track it in real time. It's updated regularly. But he sent a text to us, and we looked at the data and the research he's finding. His concern is over the fact that the big tech companies, Google and Facebook Meta, are sending out get out the vote reminders to people that are on their platforms, which, that sounds great. The problem is that those that are self-identified liberals are getting it much more persistently than those that are conservative. So, based on the data that we just saw, that Facebook Meta is sending out get out the vote reminders at a 2-to-1 rate to those that are liberal over those that are conservative. And then in certain states, in the state of Wisconsin, over the last 3 days, there's no evidence of any of them being sent to conservatives, but get out the vote reminders are going to political liberals quite heavily. So you may be listening to this podcast and wondering, well, what do I care? How's that going to influence my vote? The problem is if you're listening to this podcast, you are engaged, you are interested in these issues. This is really focused on voters who feel a guilt or an obligation that they should vote. They really aren't paying attention. And so these sorts of things, you'd be surprised how it can trigger people to certain actions, influence the decisions they're making. And according to Epstein, this could have potentially a pretty interesting and serious effect on some races like in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania.
So those are people getting information about when you actually should vote. And there's other people that you're concerned about who are getting information that's not accurate about when actually Election Day is.
That's exactly right. So the other thing I'm tracking, and I know you're tracking a couple things as well, is a super PAC called All Vote. All Vote. Sounds nice, right? Everybody should get out to vote. This is a very secretive super PAC. It's hard to ascertain who's actually behind it, but some great work by the people at Free Beacon, Washington Free Beacon, have uncovered that this is being funded by guys like Reid Hoffman, who's a big supporter of Kamala Harris, does not like Donald Trump, which of course he's entitled to have that view. But the problem with this All Vote super PAC is that in certain states, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia, what do those states have in common? Might they be swing states in the election? That this PAC, funded by Reid Hoffman and others, is sending out false information about the voting status of people. In other words, they're sending out texts saying, thank you for voting to conservatives
who haven't voted yet.
Like,
is the goal that you're going to trick them? Like maybe they voted and they forgot? Like, oh, I got this message that I voted. Maybe I don't need to vote. Is that the idea behind it?
The concern is that this misinformation could lead to voter suppression, which is a term that gets tossed around. And in fact, some local officials, including Democrats, have said, no, this is destructive. This is not good. It needs to be looked into and investigated. Hoffman kind of has a history of this. You remember there was a Senate race in Alabama in 2018, very closely contested. And he was caught supporting efforts through a PAC to create fictitious conservative influencers to try to get people to vote for the Democrat in that race. He later apologized for that and said, look, I shouldn't have done that. It was probably not a good idea. But the point is, he has a history of, let's say, maybe some dirty tricks. So this is something else to watch. Again, you think like, are people that stupid?
Yeah.
But the fact is, let's say you didn't vote and you get a text that said, thank you for voting. You might be confused. You might panic. You might say, oh, well, I'm not even going to bother to vote.
Or
it could have a potential effect.
You might think it's evidence of someone has voted on your behalf and now you're engaged on that, and it kind of bogs down the system.
It creates chaos. So those are the couple of things I'm tracking. What are you tracking? Because this is something you've been working on really for like 7 or 8 years, this issue of voter fraud and ballot integrity.
Yeah, I think this is, it's a real thing, and I think it's very important because who knows what's going to happen in the next week. But I would say the good news on the election integrity front is stuff's being flagged on the front end that appears to be quite legitimate. And also, I think there's some people that are able to have, honest conversations about what's not. So a thing that has gone viral, it was seen more than 13 million times on X, is there's this video of a postman carrying, or somebody in like civilian clothes, carrying what resembled to be a ballot-filled bin into a county election office, and people say it's in Pennsylvania, but he's got Rhode Island plates. Like, what's going on? Is this Fulton County at midnight all over again?
And what's the true story here?
So the true story is this guy actually does work for the post office. He's the acting postmaster himself, bringing the ballots into a Northampton County election office. He's just literally doing his job.
Yeah.
Now, the good news is that Republican Secretary of the Commonwealth, a guy named Al Schmidt, who is in my book in a positive light. Now, he's been kind of cast in some potentially villainous spot. I mean, Donald Trump asked him to do some stuff. He kind of stood up to Donald Trump. And so Democrat Governor Josh Shapiro is the one that appointed him to be the head of the top election official, essentially, in the state of Pennsylvania. But he comes from the city of Philadelphia, where he has previously flagged, voter fraud stuff. So this is a guy who's had an appetite to do things.
So he's trying to play it straight.
He's trying to play it very straight, but he's the one saying, look, this is not that, right? This is not, right. The video you've seen of the guy in Rhode Island plates is not evidence of voter fraud.
Yeah.
Now, we do have evidence that people are attempting to commit voter fraud. The good news potentially is that it may have been flagged and caught. The bad news is that just because you're catching more of it in one spot doesn't mean it's not happening elsewhere. But you got 3 different counties in Pennsylvania. You got Monroe County, you've got York County, and Lancaster County. all in Pennsylvania, and they've identified potentially hundreds of fraudulent voter registration applications.
So what does that mean? And how could that affect an election?
Well, the fact that they've been caught means that those applications won't. But if you have a fraudulent voter application, how voter fraud potentially happens, the biggest vulnerability, in my opinion, of election integrity is if you have a fraudulent registration or a fraudulent application and they make their way onto the voter roll, because now you have an extra voter that shouldn't be there.
Right.
It's worth pointing out, by the way, that technically doesn't even count as voter fraud necessarily. Voter fraud is like if I show up and vote as Peter Schweizer.
Right.
But, when you kind of create these fictitious names or people that shouldn't be on the voter rolls, but they get on there, they're potentially able, when you have lots of extra ballots floating around.
So the concern here is that these fraudulent, made-up names, and how many are there? 30,000, you said?
There's different counties, but like 2,500 voter registration applications in one county, in Lancaster County. They said up to 60% of those that have been reviewed by the detectives have been deemed as fraudulent.
Okay.
And there's a potentially a much larger story there. The group that's out there gathering and kind of stimulating all these voter registration applications are linked to an Arizona city councilman who used to work for Get Out the Vote effort down there. And, then there's some questions about like Soros money ties. And of course, Soros money is tied to like Mark Elias. And that's kind of what my book was about, the overlap of the people that get paid to create these vulnerabilities that exist and the people that fund the groups to go out and like funnel all that voters through those vulnerabilities.
Right.
But yeah, you've got 3 different counties in Pennsylvania that are flagging, they're saying, hey, we see these fraudulent voter registration applications. And so on the one hand, it's good. People say, well, that means the system is working. On the other hand, it also means that there's clearly an effort to flood the zone with fraudulent voter applications. And some people would suggest that that's quite problematic, especially in places that don't take it as seriously. And remember, Pennsylvania, that's on our radar. In 2012, Peter Schweizer, 59 different precincts in the city of Philadelphia recorded 0 votes for Mitt Romney. 0. Which, like, even any kind of objective political scientist
just mathematically
impossible.
Yeah.
Impossible.
Improbable. So it's a major concern. And to your point, I mean, this is a point you make in your book, Fraud, and you've emphasized before is, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, you don't know what you don't know. So you caught these fraudulent applications. You don't know if you caught all of them. You don't know if some got through. You don't know if another organization was engaged in this. That's the problem with this. So some people are going to say, oh, this is proof that the system works. And it is a good, encouraging sign. But it doesn't mean that now we don't have to be vigilant.
Well, and what I would say is that one thing over the last 4 years, because of the issues that were raised and the questions, and you could call, whatever happened in 2020, some people like the refusal to accept, the ballot, and that's not patriotic, and our system relies on the peaceful transfer of power. We've seen 4 different elections overturned, small local elections, just in the last year. One was in Wisconsin because of 2 ballots, and it was a margin of 1 vote that changed it. But then you've seen mayoral races in Connecticut and a local election in Louisiana. So the point is, more and more people are flagging this and saying, wait a minute, no, we're going to make sure we have honest elections. And they're raising the issue, I think, proactively. And so that's a positive sign. And so I think, that's not a thing that happened 4 years ago, and I think that we're all sort of on alert and on notice now that in a way that we weren't before.
Yeah. So any other thoughts that you have? What should, on election night, as people watching returns, again, you want to be vigilant, but you don't want to be reactive every time somebody claims there's voter fraud. What are you encouraging people to look for, and what should they be mindful of as the election results come in?
Well, don't share the video of the guy in the Volvo with the Rhode Island plates.
Right. Good advice. Good advice.
I would say let's just breathe. And I would say the good news is, and we've heard this consistently, there's a lot more people paying attention. There's a lot more people monitoring the system now. And so, I think just as illegal votes dampen the weight of, or I guess erode the weight of legitimate votes, I think false claims of election integrity violations also erode the credibility of the real ones. So
yeah. Think about what we've seen in the country over the years with false claims of racism, right?
Yeah.
These sort of made up, the Jussie Smollett. Does that actually help the cause of dealing with racism in the country? No, it hurts it because people think it's not serious. Same thing you could say about voter fraud. If you make up claims and they're false claims that aren't real, it cheapens the notion that it actually does exist. For me, what I'm going to be watching for election night is how long it takes for returns to come in. I mean, think about this. I remember this from the 2020 election. The state of Florida, which is now the 3rd largest state in the United States, by the morning after the election, with the exception of a couple thousand overseas military ballots, had counted all the ballots. The city of Philadelphia was still counting ballots 4 days later. How is that possible? So I am going to be watching very closely, and I think there's going to be more monitoring now than there was in 2020. How long is it taking? If it's taking Philadelphia several days to count the ballots, that's when you worry about real fraud taking place.
Yeah, this would actually be one of the few elections in which it would be acceptable for Mitt Romney to get no votes in Philadelphia. So I'm okay with it this time. The other thing I'll be watching for, just because you brought it up, is it would actually be amazing if Jesse Smollett did commit voter fraud. Like, that'd be great. That would check a lot of boxes for us, and that's kind of, fingers crossed. Regardless of whatever happens, come on, Jesse, you got this.
Well, we appreciate it, as always, listening to this podcast, and especially this special podcast. We will be on again in a couple of days with our weekly podcast, and we will certainly be running down what we know about the election at that point. So thank you again for listening. Until next time.